for joining. Good morning, good afternoon for all the folks out there. Thanks for joining. My name is David Eisenbahn. I'm a partner with EYP Mission Critical Facilities. I'm based in New York City, and I would like to introduce our guest speakers today, Kevin Sanders and Rob Myers, who will be presenting the first webinar from our webinar series. The topic of today's presentation would be on data center sourcing for enterprise organizations and institutions. Next slide, please. We're proud to share with you our mix between experience and innovation with the EYP Mission Critical Facilities webinar series. All of the webinars will take place in November. Each webinar will cover a different topic that we believe will be relevant to your day-to-day experience, your strategic planning, as well as your cost effectiveness. Today, we will cover our first webinar. Next week, on Friday the 16th, at the same time, the second webinar will be about understanding the economic advantages of a hybrid cloud environment, which will include key elements to drive costs between in-house and multi-cloud environments. Our third and last webinar of the month will take place on the week after Thanksgiving. On Friday the 30th, the topic of discussion will be about operating your data centers more effectively. As an extra note, the attendees on each webinar will have the eligibility to receive one IEEE continuing education credit per each session. To obtain a certificate, you may request it in our chat room by posting your name and email, or you can also send us an email to info@eypmcfinc.com, and after filling up the questionnaire, we will be sending you the certificate of completion. Next slide, please. We would like to welcome our speakers, Kevin Sanders and Robert Myers. Kevin has over 35 years of experience in the planning, design, implementation, and management of data centers, information systems, and network and communication systems. As a consultant for the past 25 years, he has worked with many colleges and research universities, healthcare, pharmaceutical, and financial institutions, including from the Fortune 100 list. Kevin is the managing principal responsible for all client strategic data center consulting work for EYP Mission Critical Facilities. Kevin spearheaded the use of both financial and technical architecture models to allow clients to understand the cost timeline for infrastructure, technology, and organizational options to assist CIOs, CTOs, and CFOs in the control and predictability of their hybrid IT and data center budgets. Robert Myers has more than 20 years of experience supporting every facet of facility and technology design, including standard procedural development and application systems analysis. As an integral part of the EYP Data Center strategic team, he's responsible for data center facilities and technology-focused consulting for EYP's varied client groups. Robert provides general consulting services such as technology requirements, facility requirements, IT architecture, and customer need analysis. Robert is a certified data center design professional whose practice has spanned the education, financial, healthcare, governmental, and general business process. Next slide, please. For those who don't know our portfolio, we also offer the complete solution, including design services, integration, commissioning, feasibility studies, and energy. In this presentation, our focus will be in strategy. Our strategy group has performed over 500 data center strategy engagements, including roadmaps, co-location studies, site selections, and data center consolidations on both IT and facilities. If you have questions like how to deal with unplanned changes in the IT load, how to deal with the impact of mergers or acquisitions on the data center and IT environments, how can I create and convince my team to build a data center strategy in my organization that contains a strategy mix between on-prem, co-location, and cloud. I'm interested in co-location, but I don't know how much capacity I need, how to structure an RFP, and evaluate potential options and TCO. Well, you're in the right spot. So let's begin with our data center sourcing for enterprise organization and institutions webinar. Thank you, Kevin.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining. Before we get into the meat of today's discussion, and I turn this over to Rob, I just wanted to spend a minute or so talking about a sort of a sidebar to the strategy work that David was talking about that we generally perform. Doing that large number of roadmaps, we've begun to understand the kinds of stresses and the kinds of issues that organizations of all types have in promoting and managing and selling data center roadmaps, data center strategies, data center sourcing strategies internally. And so we have some observations. We are lucky in that we get to sit and look at how organizations sort of organically react to this whole discussion, this whole topic of data centers. And typically when we show up with a client, we find that many organizations are in some stage of doing some work. But oftentimes it's in stovepipes. And for those of you who do work in large or even small organizations, you know that work is organized into ownership areas. And we find that the IT folks are, working on some of the challenges there. The folks who are doing operations and maintenance and control and management of the data centers are doing their thing. The application owners are doing their thing. Everyone understands that there is a requirement to get some strategy work done. But we tend to see that it's stovepiped a lot, and that creates a real challenge in that, selling this internally is sometimes more important than perhaps the most, the best technology solution. We find in particular that organizations, when they're beginning to look at some degree of change, use a lot of data. Some of it's good, some of it's bad. I often like to say it's the 1 degree navigational error. If you're off by 1 degree in your chart and you're and you're sailing around the world, it's not going to be pretty when you finally end up someplace 3,000 miles later. And there is a willingness sometimes to get to an answer and to accept data that is less than empirical, less than really complete. And we find that because you're building decisions on decisions on decisions, particularly in very complex strategies, the requirement for data needs to be pretty tight. We also find that organizations don't coordinate particularly well with finance, and one of the things that's interesting is sometimes the lack of recognition at the front end of a project that you have to sell this internally. And in almost every instance, there's a huge financial hurdle that you have. Rob's going to talk about that later. But we have often urged organizations to bring the finance folks in at the highest possible level and make them part of every single step. Failure to address long-standing problems. This is a big issue, and one particular for Rob. An example of that is disaster recovery. Most organizations that we work with have some kind of disaster recovery plan. Whether or not it's actually implementable or it works remains to be seen. And we often say that don't avoid those problems which you've been avoiding for some period of time. Sweep them into the bag of things you're going to address with a data center strategy and handle them within the context of this work. And again, there tends to be a real focus on technology. People like all of us on this call, like to talk about technology, like to get to the end of the solution, and sometimes we lose sight of the fact that we need an executable plan, that you have to phase these plans, and it may take several years. And probably one of the biggest problems that we see is an organization's inability to understand the degree of change that they can absorb. These kinds of multi-year projects can really tax an organization in terms of its skill sets and the numbers of people and its overall success. And so we often stress to our clients again, that a plan has to be swallowed. It has to be executable, and that sometimes means that it's got to be staged, and that all the technologies and all the things we want at the front end aren't going to be available. I'm going to turn this over to Rob now. It's going to go through the meat of this discussion today, and I'll meet you up at the end. Rob?
Great. Thanks, Kevin. Why don't we just jump right in and get into what we were here for, is sourcing planning. So today we see that there seems to be 4 common issues with which we hear from organizations over and over that they tend to be addressing as independent problems. That's the first mistake, as Kevin just discussed in the stovepipe example, and it's a common shortfall in planning. The first issue we always hear about is aging infrastructure. It's nearing the end of life. Question is, should we rebuild? Should we just exit and get out of it altogether? What loads does it need to support for today and in the future? The second item we always hear a lot about is data center consolidation. Too many data centers and server room sprawl is a common issue with most organizations we talk to. And they want to be able to consolidate, reduce their footprint, manage less server rooms and data centers, and operate more efficiently. And then, of course, you have cloud adoption. All companies that we've talked to have begun this strategy at some level, but to what extent and how quickly, that varies. And how much can it really save an organization in cost? Derek, as Dave mentioned earlier, my colleague will be discussing that in more detail during next week's webinar, but that is definitely a hot topic for today and needs to be looked at. And finally, there's cost control. In keeping the costs predictable and under control while supporting and maintaining the business operations is continually a constant struggle we hear about. During today's discussion, we'll focus on exploring these and other elements that need to be projected, defined, and evaluated so you can align your sourcing strategy with current and future IT business needs. So, in order to ensure you address all the necessary data points that we're talking about, when developing a strategy, we find the best approach to be a master planning approach that encompasses all of the issues into one master plan of attack, and that it works for the entire company as a whole and not just the independent departments within the company. This approach does encompass multiple organizations and multiple stakeholders. This is undoubtedly going to bring with it differing priorities and multiple ongoing projects that will affect the data center strategy. However, we need to bring the stakeholders together to build a cohesive strategy. It builds a team, and it builds a team with the proper visions to develop the plan that can be supported as it moves through the bureaucratic approval process. And we all know that the approval process is the end game that we're all shooting for. In the end, a technical solution will be important. It's probably going to be the most important item, but if the benefits can't be articulated well and the cost can't be justified, it's not going to get any approval. So how do you go about putting together the master plan? As mentioned earlier, putting together the master plan takes input from many different stakeholders. You need to build and understand the different profiles that need to be taken into consideration. So you have IT profiles, you have the business profiles, you have risk profiles, what's acceptable levels of risk, and the facilities profiles. You need to gather this information from all the various stakeholders, and during that process, new stakeholders to be interviewed are going to come up based on that interview process, and you'll also probably get an increased number of related projects that could affect the planning as well. Examples of stakeholders that you'd want to interview would be IT subject matter experts. You have storage, network, server, your architecture teams. Definitely want to talk to your facility subject matter experts, the ones who are running your electrical plants, mechanical plants, the general operations teams. Your financial SMEs, as Kevin mentioned earlier, get your accounting teams in from the beginning. They'll help us understand what we're actually spending today and how should we package that financial information for the intended audience at the end. And of course, you do want to listen to any of the C-level sponsors for the program. You want to understand what their vision of the future is. That's going to be a critical driver. The types of items that you discuss with the stakeholders are shown in those gray boxes I have on the slide. And as you can see, these needs will tend to build on each other. So as you go from left to right, they get more and more detailed, and you see the different stakeholders that are involved there. But it's important that we ensure that these different needs and priorities are addressed during the planning process. I mean, essentially, we're going to be housing the engines for our businesses today, so we need to develop a plan that will enable continued business and organizational growth. We want to deliver something better than what we have today. So the considerations that I mentioned earlier from the previous slides really break down into these four categories to organize the data and enable a master planning approach. So we like to think of these programs as a problem with the demand side of an equation and the supply side of the equation. Demand side is where you define the requirements that are going to be used as inputs for developing end state solution, which is the supply side of the equation. For the demand side of the equation, we need to develop the requirements necessary to build end state options. To do this, we must perform the capacity projections for the amount of space, power, and cooling that will be necessary to support the future IT loads. And we must also identify all the technical and business requirements that drive the quantity of data centers, resiliency, and the locations of these data centers. But equally important are the non-technical constraints that must be taken into consideration. Are there any regulatory issues, that we need to consider? What about certifications required? Are there any budget constraints that have been put in place already? And what about public perception sensitivities that we need to be considering? Things like that. I'm sure there's many others people can think of. And then you do have the supply side of the equation. Where are we going to put all of our stuff in? There's plenty of options to choose from, and the list keeps on changing and growing, from building your own data center to completely outsourcing your facilities to third parties or the cloud, and some combination of both. The combination of both is definitely the most common scenario we're seeing today. But how do you go about actually developing that plan? We understand all the inputs that we need, but how do you actually go about building it? So we, EYP MCF, we've developed a methodology in which we break the program into different manageable work streams. And we use the outputs of the different work streams for the decision-making process and eventually building the business case for the future state strategy. The work streams we use are capacity modeling, facility assessments, future state planning and scenario development, the COLO RFI, and the financial analysis are the work streams that we most often utilize. They might be tweaked here and there depending on the client. And it's not necessarily the case that each work stream would be required for each organization either. For instance, it already might be stated that we're not going to use COLO as an option, so we remove the COLO RFI work stream. Although in my experience, that's always a risky one to remove, because when we go to present at the C-level, that's always a common question: was COLO evaluated as an option? But it's possible. And, there are other decisions that might rule out existing facilities assessments. Is the business has decided they're getting out of the data center business and they don't want to own and operate data centers anymore. So looking at the existing facility isn't as critical. But the point is, what we're trying to say is that the process, it's not that this is the process that must be followed, but rather that breaking the program down into identifiable work streams for your work teams is the approach that we found that allows us to build a solid plan with so many different variables. The work streams that we go through, most of them are run in parallel, and the outputs of one work stream is usually an input into another work stream. So the point I'm trying to make here is that even within the master planning program, we can't have those siloed work efforts. It still needs to be a complete team. So I'll be taking a bit deeper dive into some of these areas of the work streams in the following slides, to review the data types and the building blocks that will be necessary to develop an end state cohesive plan. So the first building block I want to talk about is capacity planning. So inaccurate capacity planning is a common pitfall that we actually see in the industry. We're seeing more and more enterprises that have built up too much capacity, and they're looking for ways to offload that liability. 10 or so years ago, data centers were primarily running out of space and power, and the thought was this need would continue. So companies built with that tremendous amount of growth in mind. But as luck would have it, advances in technology came, virtualization, flash storage, and the like, and that growth pretty quickly turned into maintaining steady state, and then in some places even reduction. So it's not to imply that the applications weren't being developed that required more and more resources, just that the hardware technology was keeping up in a way that seemed to match the space and power needs, and, like I said, in some cases, reducing those capacity needs. But this realization has led us to start looking for flexible solutions that can not only accommodate unexpected growth in capacity, but also unexpected reduction in capacity need. Obviously, there's exceptions to this where growth is still moving at a pretty rapid pace. This would be like high performance computing and university and research institutions. But that's a unique subset of the typical industry. And, when you actually perform the capacity modeling, you want to make sure you break up the model into categories that'll be beneficial for the organization to understand and be able to assess and validate the result. Our experience finds that dividing the model into IT platforms, business units, and functions tends to provide the best window for the multiple stakeholders who are going to be interested in assessing the results. So when you're forecasting the organization's capacity needs for the future, you're going to have to put in varying inputs to accurately define what that growth model will look like. Examples would be, what's the existing inventory? Obviously, you have to start with that. But then what's the organic growth? Any new virtualization we're planning on implementing? Any other new initiatives that are coming up that will affect the footprint? What's the refresh rate? Any new hardware standardization that's changing? Migrations that are underway or future migrations? Mergers and acquisitions is another big unknown. But many times individuals will know a certain merger or acquisition is happening and that some are planned in the future. We want to take that into account. And then, of course, again, the new trendy topic, the cloud adoption. What is the quantified effect of cloud offloading to your on-prem environment? Will you end up replatforming? Will there be growth in off-prem hardware, possibly a reduction in your on-prem hardware? Again, Derek will cover some of this next week, but the true effect of cloud adoption on your data center needs to be looked at. And all of these items are going to be captured by talking to the organizational subject matter expert. I'm sure people on this call can come up with other topics that I missed that would be necessary to take into consideration for your own personal organizations or your customers as well. So then we move on to looking at our existing facilities. So when we want to assess our future state strategy, it really does help us understand what assets are we really starting with. What is the organization's current state portfolio? What functions of those data centers do they perform? And what are the resiliency levels of those currently today? Do they meet the current needs, and can they meet the needs of the future? And the only way to really answer these questions is to properly assess the data centers and understand their current physical condition. Items to evaluate would be current space on the raised floor. How's it laid out? Hot aisle, cold aisle? Is there room for more racks on the floor? Is there any known existing MEP and structural concerns? Are there any what are the current electrical loads at the data center? What are the current capacities of the UPS and generator? Of course, we want to know any single points of failure, what type of fire protection is installed, what physical security is in place, and can the site itself be expanded if we want to add, let's say, more modules if growth is needed. And of course, another key step in the evaluation, it always comes down to what the estimated costs would be to renovate such a facility. Should any gaps be identified during the analysis process saying that the facility couldn't support the future state? To be honest, it's very rare that some sort of investment would not need to be made, but it's important to note also, if you currently own your data centers, that proper maintenance and operations of the facility is really a huge key in its longevity and reliability. I believe the third webinar that David mentioned earlier will dig into these topics on how to effectively and efficiently operate your data center. But my point being, if you have an existing data center and you take care of it well, chances are it can do you well into the future. If you didn't take care of it well, it might run into some issues and be very costly to get up to the level that we need. And then there's co-location. And as I said earlier, co-location is likely going to be a component of any future modern strategy today. It's the new trend we're seeing. But selecting the right one is not easy, and it must be done with care to ensure that it can meet the organization's needs. So just as much care as you would go into building your own data center and making decisions on that. I mean, there's different flavors of colo. You have retail, wholesale, managed services, and many now are even offering quick connections to cloud service providers. So it's important to evaluate the various providers, taking into consideration what your needs are today and what the anticipated needs for the future might be. Can the colo accommodate current projected space and power needs? Does the data center meet resiliency requirements? Does the physical location pose any geographical risks that really aren't acceptable to the business? Are the remote hand services that we are going to require available? And let's not forget, what is it really going to cost us to run in a colo? This information related to these items can initially be gathered by going through a request for information process with colo providers and then evaluating their responses. Now, after that evaluation, if it is deemed colo as a viable sourcing option, it's recommended to come up with a short list of the potential candidates and physically make on-site visits to validate that the site does actually meet the requirements. A complete evaluation of a co-location provider would encompass thorough review of economics, risk, the proposed solution, what their support model is, and what are the lease provisions. But there's even other considerations to look at now that go beyond just location and the facility itself. For example, we're finding consolidation within the industry is happening at a pretty quick rate, and it leads us to believe that it's going to continue to happen for at least the short term. So change of ownership could truly happen during any life of the contract. And other costs need to be considered besides just the non-recurring charges and monthly recurring charges that would be disclosed during an RFI response. You still need to take into account migration costs, design costs, new hardware costs, etc. Again, what's it really going to cost to be up and running in the co-location environment? So, continuing on with the sourcing options discussion, we've already discussed obtaining baseline data for the existing facilities and co-location facilities. But when we want to put together a whole solution, we also need to consider other hosting possibilities and what their pros and cons and which variations of these options do we really want to consider. In today's world, again, we have to look at cloud offerings and understand how the company is looking to utilize and take advantage of this technology. But in general, most strategies will have cloud in some form and should be included in the overall planning strategy. But the true costs and efforts do need to be considered. You might have you will have application transformation activities depending how far you go, and there's going to be new skill sets required to manage the new environment, even with the public cloud and if you have sort of a hybrid private public cloud. And now, the evaluation of owned facilities, I want to point out, and the condition and the cost assessments really should come from a knowledgeable source when you're looking at building or renovating these facilities. Kind of a shameless plug for EYP MCF right now, but we're one of those firms. But in all seriousness, there's other firms out there, and these firms would be familiar with data center construction and design. Firms that aren't familiar with the uniqueness of data center construction and design and estimations can truly lead to major timeline and cost estimation errors. Not meant to be a criticism, it's just a fact of the uniqueness of a data center design and construction. We've personally had customers that have had $1 million of overruns from not using experienced firms to advise in these situations. These type of builds are not common for most organizations to undertake. Could be a once-in-a-lifetime project for many people, and the process is not the same as a typical multi-use tenant building. And the gap is really best defined by, or best filled by companies that do this for a living. And as stated earlier, almost all planning for data centers would involve some sort of co-location. In our experience, similar to the understanding for construction of a data center, procurement of a co-location is not something most companies do on a regular basis either. And it's not similar to the typical office space tenant leases that are negotiated. Therefore, we recommend using a partner if you don't have that expertise in-house, similar to what we would say for renovation and estimations. We recommend the same for the co-location procurement process. There are firms like us and others that have extensive and deep experience with the RFI, RFP process specifically for data centers. They have good knowledge of available facilities. They have experience with assessing and analyzing the proposed short and long-term costs. And another item for consideration in procurement is the protection against a shrinking footprint. Typical contracts go for a growing footprint, but an experienced consultant will help you protect yourself from the possibility of having to reduce your footprint in the future as well. So that leads us to taking a look at the topologies in terms of where you're going to put your data centers and how far apart they should be and the number of them that will meet the business risks. This is really the last building block that we need in order to start developing the end state scenarios. So you're going to need to decide how many data centers are needed, how far apart they should be, what would be the desirable regions for them. And these decisions are all driven by application requirements, the future IT architecture plans, and of course, the business strategy and business requirements. You know, do you need application redundancy? Does it have to be between data centers? What are those latency requirements? Is there a dedicated disaster recovery site required? What about the resiliency levels of the individual data centers? What content is being hosted in each one of them? Can they be at different resiliency level? And I want to point out that it is possible to come up with multiple topologies that might be acceptable for the organization. So taking these topologies, combining them with various sourcing options, we can develop end state scenarios to be evaluated as to how well they'll satisfy the business or the institution. During this process, though, we also find that consensus on the scenarios starts to be getting developed by the stakeholders. And also people start preferring certain scenarios over another and making their minds up ahead of time. So it's something while you're developing this strategy, you want to try to control. So how do we pull it all together and develop the end state scenarios? So we've gone through the work streams. We've gathered all of our necessary building blocks. We've done the capacity planning, the technical requirements gathering, identification of non-technical requirements, came up with our solution alternatives. We put them into what I like to refer to as our analysis funnel, and we generate a number of scenarios to evaluate and to compare which one will best suit the organization's needs and future plan. Now, once we develop this group of scenarios that we want to evaluate, we need to take those scenarios and put them into an implementation plan in terms of how the contents housed inside those data centers and topology will migrate to new data centers and topology. I mean, of course, some might stay as well if you're reusing existing facilities, just for example. But by doing this implementation phasing process, it will allow us to create a timeline and a cash flow and a total cost of ownership for each scenario. Very important to be able to tell the whole story when we're trying to get approval for such a program. So this slide shows an example of a cash flow representation for a single scenario. This is one of the most attention-getting slides we found whenever we're doing executive briefing. It really comes down to this and some overview of some other financial analysis. But you'll notice that it does include more tasks than just build a data center or procure a co-location. Many more tasks and many more costs that need to be included, and that'll span multiple years. In this example, the construction of the data center was actually only half of the overall program cost. So you need to work with your stakeholders, the finance team, and your technical subject matter experts to develop as accurate as possible duration and cost estimates for the program. As applied in the previous slide, financial analysis is always the area of the report that gets the most attention from the C-suite. The analysis should provide cost comparison of all scenarios considered, and the financial analysis should include a 10-year cost of ownership, year-by-year cash flow analysis, project net present value, and an internal rate of return. Again, it is key to work with the finance department to ensure that when you're communicating these numbers in the financial analysis, it's in a familiar view for the audience. So they're not trying to figure out what the chart says. It should be familiar for them, and they're actually trying to understand the actual cost and the effects of their organization. Now, the last building block that we talk about, definitely not the least in my opinion, is the technical evaluation. So another key step in our methodology encompasses developing criteria to evaluate the technical merits of the scenarios. We do this so that the important criteria, such as security and reliability and latency, doesn't get overshadowed just by the financial analysis. The process involves jointly developing the criteria in ways from the ground up with the customer. It's not done just by us or by a consultant. It really is a team effort. The process forces participants to focus on a set of criteria and how well that particular scenario satisfies that criteria. This enables us to remove some of the subjectivity of evaluating the scenarios, which is a natural human trait. And is over the process developing these scenarios, individuals instinctively end up favoring one over another. And this process helps separate that favoring and just look at it individually. But by evaluating the technical merits separately from the financial analysis, it allows you to make recommendations based on how well the solution meets the organization's need while also being cost effective, not just saving money. Essentially, assessing which scenario is the best bang for your buck, which isn't always the cheapest solution. And this process, and demonstrating this process, helps demonstrate that reality to the decision maker. So, how do we end this thing and build the plan? Well, through this rigorous analysis, you'll be building the foundation of the funding documents needed for executive board approval. So, in general, you're going to build a unique document for the organization company. Each one is different. Each organization has different needs, and therefore telling the story will require a unique narrative. But there's also one consistent item needed after developing this final report that we find, and that's that there's a need to generate targeted subsets of the report for the different audiences required for approval. And this usually goes on for a couple months after issuing the final report. You will need to generate decks that will be able to be understood or looked at by the CIO, CFO, and executive committees. This approach we found is an approach that we found builds a momentum and keeps the process moving. It doesn't just result in this 400-page large document sitting on a shelf. That being said, that full 400-page document will become a valuable resource and reference when moving through the implementation process. And we even have one client that jokes that they refer to our strategy document as their data center Bible. But that being said, we've also done multiple iterations of strategies for clients. Often business needs will change and the strategy needs to be realigned. Or as you're talking and present the final report, some new undisclosed requirements might surface and need to be recommended into the plan. The main point is, even though you're going to develop this master plan, it's a living document and it needs to be reviewed and updated over time.
Thank you, Rob and Kevin. It's been a wonderful presentation. If you have questions, feel free to write them down in the chat room or unmute your microphone. You can also follow up with us offline by emailing us at info@eypmcfinc.com. Thank you.